Hello and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on ransomware. This one is about heroes, villains, and lessons of 2024. So before we get into this fascinating subject today, we do have a few housekeeping items that are going to help you get the most out of the session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. So not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. That Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from, and it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event that you have any technical issues. So a browser refresh will fix most issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these expert series events are special product neutral looks at sorry, I was having some slide trouble there. They're special product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. But the support of our sponsors make it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to those sponsors. So over the next few slides, I'm going to share some messages from our sponsors today, and they'll refer to links that you can find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. As always, the handout section also has a link to Actual Tech Media's amazing lineup of upcoming events. That resource is called the ATM Event Center, and you're sure to find other informative webinars in there that you'll want to attend. So now, before we get into the main presentation, a few words from our sponsors. We are supported by Commvault. While a disaster recovery plan is essential to protecting your company's infrastructure, you won't be fully protected unless you also have a cyber recovery plan and testing strategy in place too. So Commvault Cloud Cleanroom Recovery provides a clean, secure, isolated recovery environment on demand for testing cyber recovery plans, conducting secure forensic analysis, and uninterrupted continuous business. So visit commvault.com to learn more and request a personalized demo of Cleanroom Recovery to see it in action. Today's event is also sponsored by Rubrik. Cyber attacks are here to stay. Keep your data secure, monitored, and accessible everywhere it lives so you can bounce back fast. Start crafting your cyber recovery blueprint at the link on your screen or the link in your handouts. This event is also brought to you by Druva. The Druva Data Security Cloud is a fully managed SaaS solution offering air-gapped and immutable data protection across cloud, on-premises, and end-user environments. Druva enhances traditional security measures and enables faster incident response, effective cyber remediation, and robust data governance. With its autonomous approach, Druva puts data security on autopilot and helps businesses effectively respond and remediate from all the modern data risks. And we're supported by SentinelOne. The SentinelOne Singularity Platform prevents, detects, and responds to cyber attacks at machine speed, greater scale, and higher accuracy across endpoint, cloud, and identity. Find out about the big ways the Singularity Platform defends against ransomware in the free ransomware ebook from SentinelOne. You'll discover how powerful generative AI capabilities, efficient dashboards, and threat intelligence support threat hunters. Rollback remediation helps preserve business continuity. Vulnerability and exposure management helps illuminate dark corners of your business. And deception tools can obstruct, disrupt, and misdirect attackers. So download the ebook to find out more now. And finally, we are sponsored by Zerto. Learn how Zerto's Cyber Resilience Vault and associated technologies can help protect your business. So visit the link in the resources section to find out more information like hands-on labs and how to keep your data safe from ransomware and other cyber threats. So once again, take advantage of that handout section where you can find all the links that you've just seen. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic session. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Allan Liska. Allan has written several books on security, including Ransomware, Understand, Prevent, Recover, which is now in its second edition. As a threat intelligence analyst at Recorded Future, Allan is one of the best informed people in the world on the state of ransomware. It's always a delight to have him here just to give us his insights about what he's seeing and hearing about with trends in the ransomware environment. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Allan to get us started.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for attending today. Really appreciate everybody's time. And to be in line with the theme of today's con, I wanted to talk a little bit about Bruce Lee and access brokers. So we're going to talk about access brokers of fury and lessons we can learn from Bruce Lee to better defend against initial access. And I want to start by talking a little bit about ransomware fatigue. Scott and everybody listening, if you know me, you know that I have talked a lot about ransomware over the last dozen or so years. And one of the things that is coming up repeatedly as I meet with leaders and executives is that they are sick of hearing about ransomware. They are tired of ransomware briefings and ransomware webinars. Obviously, you all aren't because you know it's still out there. But there is a lot of ransomware fatigue because all we keep hearing about is this latest group or this latest ransomware and so on, and it doesn't seem like anything changed. And I got to tell you, I am sick of talking about ransomware. I would love to be able to sit here and talk to Scott about like weird, obscure DNS protocols or some other type of malware or business email compromise or something like that. But the fact is, ransomware is not going away, and not talking about it isn't going to make it go away, unfortunately. Ransomware is bigger than ever. Just this year alone, there have been 3 reported 8-figure ransoms paid to ransomware actors. And if you don't think that incentivizes bad guys around the world to jump into ransomware, I'm afraid to tell you, you are very, very wrong. We have seen this year that while ransomware attacks haven't risen as quickly as they did in 2023, the amount of ransom paid to ransomware actors appears to be up significantly. So for about the same number of attacks, we are seeing bigger ransoms paid, bigger ransom demands made, etc. And so the bad guys aren't going anywhere, right? They're going to want to carry out ransomware attacks. But it's not just the ransomware actors that you have to worry about, because there's a whole ransomware ecosystem that's built around carrying out these ransomware attacks, whether we're talking about access brokers, which we are today, the operators of the ransomware as a service, the developers, the ones that carry out the attack, the ones that help with the money laundering. There are all of these different roles within this ransomware ecosystem that unfortunately means that there is a lot of money to be made by a lot of different people in carrying out ransomware attacks, and and that means that they're going to continue into the future here, that we're not seeing any indications that they're going to slow down. And I'm reminded of this quote by Bruce Lee where he said, and famously most people know be like water, but the whole quote is empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. And unfortunately, that's the world that we live in right now, where what you have is you have all of these different types of attacks being carried out by all of these different groups, all of the time, basically swarming over your network like a wave. Whether you're talking about for initial access, phishing, or credential stuffing, third party exploitation, social engineering, insider threat, all of these different types of initial access brokers are out there trying to break into your network simultaneously. And they are very good at what they do. They are carrying out these attacks all the time, and they're carrying it out constantly. And the reason is they know there is a ready market. If they can break into your network, there's a ransomware actor who will buy access to that network. And that's what that ecosystem looks like. These initial access brokers are the ones who get the access, they turn around and they sell that to the ransomware actors who carry out the attacks. So your network is basically, and you know this, you're the one who's looking at the alerts all the time, and you see all of these different phishing alerts, all of these different credentials being stolen and tried to use to log in your network, all of these scans for vulnerabilities. You see all of these things happening all the time. And that's this whole ransomware ecosystem, this initial access broker part of it. That is them basically flooding your network and trying to find those holes and use that to gain access to your network. They're basically taking Bruce Lee's words to heart, and they're being like water, but they're forming around your network. And I know when you heard that we were going to talk about Bruce Lee, you thought you were going to be Bruce Lee because everybody wants to be the hero in their story, right? You were hoping you'd be Bruce Lee and you're going to be Bruce Lee to defend against these attacks. But right now, the attackers are like Bruce Lee, and you're like thug number 5 that gets punched in the face and knocked on the ground before he switches and hits thug number 6. But we have to change that, right? We have to stop that way of thinking. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. Is we already know that bad guys are like water trying to find the holes in your network. What can you do to be more proactive to stop them? And that's because ransomware attacks move really fast. When we talk about initial access brokers, according to CrowdStrike, it takes 79 minutes from when they get initial access in your network to when they have admin control. And once they have admin control, that network is ready to sell to a ransomware operator. So it only takes them 79 minutes to do that. Takes a lot less if you've given everybody in your network local admin access. And I know I'm going to lose the fight on telling you to please stop giving everybody in your network local admin access, because I've been arguing that for 10 years and it hasn't worked. But it's true. If they have local admin access, once they hit the network, then their job's that much easier. That 79 minutes becomes 10 minutes. 10 minutes, that network is ready to sell. And then they sell that network. And there are a few ways they do that. There are open forums, open underground forums where they sell it on XSS or RAMP or Exploit. And then there are private channels on Telegram and Tox. And, depending on the reputation of the initial access broker and where the network is and the type of access, etc., it can be an immediate sale or it can take a couple of weeks to sell. But then once the affiliate has access, they take about 5 days, according to Sophos. That's the dwell time in the network. And we've seen some that move a lot faster, some that move a little bit slower, but it takes about 5 days from when the ransomware operator hits the network to when they've stolen your data. And if they're going to deploy ransomware, they've actually started encrypting your files. But according to Microsoft, within 24 hours of landing in your network, they have access to your domain controller. And once they're on the domain controller, it is so much harder to get them off of your network. Because basically, once they're on the domain controller, they own everything. They have access to everything. They can they can create new accounts. They can put in backdoors. There are all kinds of things they can do that make it that much harder to get rid of them. And so this is what we've been talking about. This is what this looks like. This is my opportunity to use my Photoshop skills, as it were. Actually, it's my stock photo skills, but you get the idea. The initial access broker gains and maintains that access, auctions it off to an affiliate, who then carries out the attack, and then the ransomware operator, the one that controls the ransomware as a service, is the one that creates tools, manages, and handles payments, etc. And a big part of this process is info stealers. We talked a little bit earlier about credential reuse. Well, credential reuse is great for initial access brokers, and they get most of those from the info stealers. So these large, millions of emails, info stealer campaigns that come out that trick you to going to a fake Microsoft site or a fake SharePoint site or fake Google site or whatever, entering your credentials and then selling those credentials. So info stealers play a big part of that. And a lot of the phishing emails that we see that eventually lead to ransomware also contain info stealers as well. So it's kind of a twofer, where they may implant something via phishing email, but they also may have an info stealer attached to that phishing email, so that they can harvest credentials as well. And the reason that I talk about info stealers is because info stealer logs are huge right now. Just for the month of August, from the top five info stealers, top four info stealers, Redline, Luma, Static, and or CLC and Vidar, we found 25 million logs for sale on the Russian market. And logs are basically all the data that's collected from info stealers. So that's just one place that info stealers are sold. And that's just four of the dozens of info stealers that are out there. That's how predominant stolen credentials are. And that's why info stealers and stolen credentials are so important to monitor for in defending against ransomware, because we're talking about the early stages here. And that's kind of what is important here, is that we're looking at ways that we can stop the attack earlier. And the way to stop that is to stop the malicious activity from the initial access brokers, because you can keep them out. You do not have to worry about the rest of the attack. And that's really what we want to focus on, is how can we prevent the ransomware attack entirely. And the way to do that is stop the initial access brokers, because it is such a division of labor um, between it is such a division of labor between the different parts of the ransomware attack. The ransomware operators don't really know how to do initial access. That's not what they're trained for now. Instead, they only know how to carry out the ransomware operation. So if you stop the info stealers, if you stop the initial access, then you stop the ransomware attack. And all of this is summed up in a great tweet from Sherrod DeGrippa, who, if you're on Twitter, I highly recommend following. And it's basically saying the same thing I've said, but in a much more succinct way. Ransomware is an ecosystem. It's full of groups who don't do ransomware, but enable it through their tooling, infrastructure, code, brokerages, and more. So don't just think about a ransomware attack as a single event. Think about it as a multi-staged event. Again, and it doesn't help that that's often the way that we report it, right? Where we report a a ransomware attack as Ransom Hub hit this network. Well, no, what we really mean when we say that is an initial access broker got access to it and then sold that access to an affiliate of Ransom Hub. Ransom Hub carried out that affiliate carried out the attack, and then the organizer, the operator behind the Ransom Hub ransomware, handled negotiations and payment if there was any made. So that's the way kind of all of that works. And again, there are these other groups that are also supportive of ransomware carrying out different attacks. So again, right now, up to this point, I've been trying to emphasize that ransomware is a complex ecosystem filled with a myriad of threat actors carrying out attacks, most of which are ransomware adjacent. And again, mention it, you see the logs, you know that your organization is constantly under attack from all of these types of initial access brokers. You get the alerts for leaked credentials, you get the alerts for new vulnerabilities. You know how bad it can be out there. So even though I'm coming from a vendor, this isn't vendor hyperbole, this is just the reality. And I'm not trying to sell you anything here. This is just kind of the reality of the way it is. So now the question is, how do you respond? If you're not Bruce Lee in the story, the guy who's not Bruce Lee generally gets his butt kicked. How do you defend against Bruce Lee? And that is the other side of sort of Bruce Lee's teaching that we can learn and benefit from, and that's his form of martial arts, which is called Jeet Kune Do, and that's how you respond. So there are basically three areas that you need to focus on for initial access: asset management, identity management, and data management or data governance. Because that's really where most ransomware attacks happen. Asset management is not just patching, although that's important, but also what systems do you have in your network? Do you know everything that's in your network and in your cloud? Identity management is, we've already talked about credential theft, but it's not just credential theft. Also, are the accounts that are logging in from where you expect them to log into? If you suddenly get a rash of logins from Romania, does that trigger an alert in your organization? What about if a machine that doesn't normally talk to another machine on the network starts having a long conversation? Is that concerning? What does that look like? So it's not just knowing what you have, but also how it's supposed to operate, and it's not knowing who you have, but what they're supposed to talk to and where they're supposed to come from. And then the last one is data governance. And data governance has traditionally fallen outside of the security world. That's been part of compliance and GRC and so on. Problem is, about 30% of ransomware attacks right now are data theft only, with no encryption involved. And it does not matter where that data comes from. If it comes from your network or your cloud, that's fine. But if it comes from one of your vendors or your vendor's clouds, that's fine too. All that matters is that your name is on it. And if you are the biggest name in data that is stolen from stolen from wherever, your name is the one that's going to get listed on the extortion site. So that's why more and more CISOs are adding data governance to their tool set or to their security requirements. They need to know where and how the data is being stored. And that's hard, right? That's something we haven't necessarily done before in security, but more organizations have to do that now, where they have to know where all our data is, which can be really hard because often most organizations don't know that if they haven't been tracking that. But it's important to know, hey, where do we outsource our human resources records to? Where do we outsource our customer data to? Where do we outsource our rewards program? Where do we outsource our file sharing? Where do we outsource our legal documents? Like, where is all that going? And so it does really require a little bit of investigation. If you've never started a data governance program within your organization, the first thing you have to do, just like with asset management and identity management, is build that baseline of where is our data? Who all have we outsourced to? And how do I keep track of where and how all of that is? So that literally means going from often department to department when you're first getting started and saying, hey, who are all of our vendors? and what data do we give them? And then once you've built that baseline, building that into the requirements process so that when a new vendor comes on board, security team gets a report of what data is going to be stored with them, how it's going to be stored, etc., and maybe even helping by setting minimum standards for security. Oh, if our data is going to go here, we have to have this. We have to have multi-factor authentication. It has to be encrypted at rest. All of these things that are important to make sure that you have, again, a minimum baseline, not just in your network and your cloud, but across all of your vendors and all of your clouds. So data governance is an increasingly important part of that because it's an increasingly important part of ransomware. And so you wind up as the CISO or the security organization having to worry about that data governance, something you may not have had to worry about before. So Jeet Kune Do is literally the way of the intercepting fist. That's how it's translated. And this is the fighting style that's developed by Bruce Lee. And the core tenet of Jeet Kune Do is intercepting the attack, striking at the attackers before they hit you. And that's what you want to think about when you're defending against initial access. Now, am I saying hack back? No, please don't. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have to think about ways that you can be more proactive in defending against initial access. So how do you do that? How do you be more proactive, again, without the obvious of hacking back, which is, for the most part, a recipe for disaster, which is why I don't recommend it. Start with some of the simple things. Monitor for leaked credentials. So Troy Hunt has a fantastic service that for a lot of organizations is freely available. It's called Have I Been Pwned? And using Have I Been Pwned to alert whenever new credentials are dumped in an underground forum or an underground market or whatever goes a long way to stopping that type of initial access. Now, there has to be a process behind this, right? It's not just enough to get the alert that one of your employees' credentials was being sold on an underground forum or an underground marketplace. You also have to be able to take action quickly to change that password or whatever else you need to do in order to secure that employee's login. So you need to make sure that you are being proactive in going after these leaked credentials and then taking the follow-on steps. And all of these things that I'm going to talk about require a follow-on step. So again, the alert isn't enough. Take action on that. You also want to scan your infrastructure for publicly accessible systems with no multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is not perfect, but it's a really good way to stop a lot of attackers, stop most attackers, in fact. And so while you should have multi-factor authentication everywhere, for some organizations that's not practical, it's hard to do, etc. Totally understand that. But you at least need to have multi-factor authentication on anything that is internet facing. Because again, if you miss one of those leaked credentials, you don't want the bad guys to be able to log right in. You want to put friction, make it harder for them to get in. And then prioritize patching vulnerabilities that are most often attacked by ransomware groups. So, for example, SSL VPNs are a very common target for ransomware actors because they know when they get on SSL VPN, they basically have access to everything. The trend that we see right now is when a new vulnerability is announced against an SSL VPN, especially one that allows for remote code execution, within 24 hours, we see bad guys scanning for that vulnerability, and within 48 hours, we see exploitation starting. And that is because the bad guys know these systems so well that it's relatively trivial for them to build new for them to build new exploits and when vulnerabilities are discovered, and get out there and start exploiting them in the wild. So you have to patch quickly. Now, everybody's going to tell you that, right? Everybody's going to say, yes, you have to patch everything quickly. And what you're rightfully going to say is, Allan, there are going to be 50,000 vulnerabilities, 50,000 CVEs released this year. I don't have the time to patch everything immediately. There aren't enough hours in the day for me to patch all the things that need to be patched. And that's right. And that's why you should be looking at better ways to prioritize. One of the things that I like to do is I like to use CISA's KEV list. That's the known exploited vulnerability list. That is the things that they see being exploited by the bad guys right now, because that takes that list of 50,000 CVEs, drops down to 100, sometimes even less, depending on what your presence is, how big your internet facing presence is, and what else you have going on. And it's a much more manageable number to patch quickly. And of course, that list is always being updated, but you can do a regular pull of the list and say, hey, this thing is being exploited now, and now I know I need to go patch this system and patch it quickly. And if instead of I have a dozen things I need to patch immediately, I have 2 things I need to patch immediately, that's a lot more manageable, and you can get that time faster. You can get the time to patch faster, and you can be more protected from the bad guys. You may not be able to get to the 48 hours that where the bad guys are going to start to exploit, and that's terrible. But that's just the reality of how networks and systems work. But if you can get to it faster, you're much less likely to get exploited. So even if you can't hit that 48-hour deadline, if you can get it patched faster than you were before, then you're continuing to do better. And again, knowing where all of your data is, both locally in your cloud and in your partners' clouds, I've kind of beaten that up a little bit, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but that is another big one that you need to worry about and make sure that you understand. These are things that are not necessarily easy to do, but they are easier than mounting a whole ransomware defense. And these kind of minimal things here will go a long way toward stopping most ransomware attacks. No, it's not going to stop all of them, because there's always new techniques and tactics that the ransomware actors are using in order to try to carry out attacks. But they will stop a lot of the attacks, and they've been consistent over the last several years as methods for ransomware actors wanting to kind of move in, gain access networks, or the initial access brokers to gain access to networks. So if you can do these things, if you can proactively monitor and address leaked credentials, continuously scan your infrastructure, looking for systems that don't have multi-factor authentication, looking for things that need to be patched, and then prioritize patching vulnerabilities most often attacked by ransomware groups, or things that are being exploited in the wild based on the KEV list, that goes a long way to stopping those. And that addresses credential reuse as an attack vector. That also addresses exploitation as an attack vector. And there's one other thing that we need to talk about, and that's phishing. So phishing obviously is a big problem, right? And again, it's another one that none of us have been able to effectively solve. As hard as we've tried, and so on. And there's some things you can do. If you use Gmail, you can opt for higher security levels in your accounts, etc. Same thing if you use Microsoft for your mail. There are higher security levels that you can set that help improve it. And that's one way to investigate it. The other thing to look at is The tools that are deployed by the initial access brokers when they carry out a phishing attacks do a lot of the same things, but one of the things they do is they like to live off the land. So to um, they like to run local commands that aren't necessarily going to trigger your EDR or whatever security tools that you have in place. So there is a company called Thinkst Canary, THINSKT, that makes a free Canary token available to anybody who wants it. And what a Canary token is it's it's a little bit of code that's installed in your registry. And what this token does is it's a Lulbins token, basically living off the lands token. And what it does is anytime anytime a series of local commands are run that are commonly used by initial access brokers and ransomware actors, it sends you an email with an alert. So maybe you can't stop all phishing emails from getting to you. Maybe you can't stop employees from clicking on phishing links, or stop all phishing emails from getting to employees in the first place, and you can't stop employees from getting clicking on phishing links. But what you might be able to do is use something like that Thinkst Canary token to alert you when there's something malicious running on one of these endpoints. So if your phishing defenses fail, if your employee's spidey sense is off a little bit that day and they wind up clicking on the link, whatever it is, you at least have that kind of backup as, oh, hey, something on this box tried to run these commands. So it does things like who am I, net, at, etc., which are common command line commands that are Windows-based commands, so they're not malicious and not usually flagged. And when it sees those run, it sends an alert. So that is one option that you have available to you as a way to better improve. If you're not going to be able to detect a phishing email, at least be able to detect when the bad guys implant something that's trying to carry out malicious activity. So, because there is so much ransomware right now, and there is so much money in it, there is a lot of incentive for new initial access brokers to start up and bring new and sometimes resuscitating long dead attack vectors. You don't get to defend against just any one of those. And that's, again, going back to that Bruce Lee model, you have to be able to fight against all seven guys at once, right? There's always that one scene in every Bruce Lee movie where, he's got to fight seven guys at once. And you have to be prepared to do that. You have to defend against all these different types of attacks, going through the steps that we talked about in order to effectively defend against initial access. It's not easy, but it is easier than trying to find a ransomware actor who's embedded himself in your domain controller. So if you can stop the threat actor from ever getting into your network, you are going to have a much better time and a much easier time defending your network. Again, not easy, but easier. And I think that's the important part. So this is your chance to be like Bruce Lee, be more proactive, go on the offense in defending against these ransomware attacks, try to stop them before they have a chance to get to your network. And that's all I have today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I know we always get a lot of great questions in these in these webinars, so I'm hoping that we're able to continue that.
Yeah, great presentation, Alan. I love the Bruce Lee references. I don't really like the idea of thinking myself as Thug Number Five, but reality is the reality. But some great tips there to flip that script there as well. So I've got some questions for you. There's some audience questions here. We'll just sort of mix them together. One of them you mentioned about those 3 8-figure ransoms that were paid out this year already reportedly. Have there been eight-figure ransoms paid in the past? Like, was there like one paid in another year, or is this the first time we've seen ransoms that big?
It's the first time we've seen three eight-figure ransoms paid. There have been eight-figure ransoms paid in the past. A
Yeah.
few years ago, an insurance company paid a $40 million ransom. And, every now and then we'd see a 12 million or a $10 million ransom come up. It was not as common. Having three in the same year, we've never seen before.
Right.
So, again, it's a sign of how much more effective the ransomware actors are, but also, um, maybe some of the stigma of paying a ransom is starting to go away, which would stink because that's, the problem with the eight-figure ransom. It's not the eight-figure ransoms themselves. It's that when you pay an eight-figure ransom, you're making it harder on everybody else. Um, I was I was on a keynote panel at the Google MWise conference a couple months now back,
Mhm.
and somebody asked what are the things that we should be doing to stop ransomware, and I kind of joked, well, there are two things that we need to do. First is drone strikes for ransomware actors. That got a huge applause. Um, the second thing is like we should all be able to line up and punch any CEO that pays an eight-figure ransom. Crickets. Nobody thought that was funny. But we need both, right? Because when you pay an eight-figure ransom, you've now made it that much harder for everybody else because you've bought more people into the ransomware ecosystem. And now there are going to be more attacks. And if you're paying an eight-figure ransom, you could have secured yourself ahead of time, right? Like,
Right.
I don't have a lot of sympathy for multi-billion-dollar companies that don't invest in security. But that small rural hospital that can afford to secure themselves, they're now an even bigger target.
Hmm. Yeah, when you talk about that ransomware ecosystem too, and this may, I'm sure this number is impossible to quantify, but has anybody looked at like how big this economy is? Like how many people are involved, in the various stages of, the ransomware bad actor market?
No, it's really hard to say because there are so when Lockbit was taken down earlier this year,
Hmm.
when NCA released the data they took from the Lockbit server, um, there were almost 200 affiliates associated with Lockbit. So that means there were 200 threat actors just for Lockbit that were carrying out Lockbit attacks. Now,
Yeah.
Lockbit was the biggest by far, but that's one number there. As far as like initial access brokers, there are so many of them because so many are freelance and
Yeah.
they'll do one or two and then disappear and then do one or two again. And then there are some that are fairly consistent. The guy behind Raccoon Stealer is currently in trial in the US. And Raccoon Stealer was a really interesting one because you could rent his infrastructure for $200 a month. So for less than a car payment, or at least for my car, and I only own a Subaru, so I'm not driving a fancy car. For less than my car payment, I could send out hundreds of thousands of emails a month,
Hmm.
potentially getting hundreds of thousands of credentials. And that's part of the problem, right? Is Raccoon Stealer was run by a guy and a couple of developers. How many customers did he have? And that's one of the things I'm sure we'll find out in the trial is
Yeah.
how many people bought his services, because it's not just the initial access brokers, but all the people buying the services as well.
Right. Hey, speaking of initial access brokers, what are you seeing in terms of the trends in terms of like what they're having success with? Is it, are they starting to focus more on, exploiting, the vulnerabilities that you were talking about? Is there a trend up or down in, phishing attacks? Like, from a big picture perspective, what are they doing?
So the big three are phishing, which is still extremely common, the info stealers, and exploitation. And there are different there are different people that specialize in different ones.
Yeah.
And so they're all active all the time because they're always scanning for them. So I do think that phishing and credential theft, credential reuse are the two biggest ones because they're the easiest, right? It's relatively easy
Okay.
to send that out. There's a
Yeah.
lot of complexities involved in exploitation and building exploits, etc. So I think phishing and and credential theft, credential reuse are the two biggest ones, with exploitation being kind of a distant third.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. As far as like the info stealers go, that's really interesting because it's like, you talk about exploitation, in a couple of days, when there are new vulnerabilities, they're sort of up with exploits. But when it comes to info stealers, where they're gathering, I think the statistic was like 25, almost 26 million names, or credentials, um, that you had up there on that one slide. Do those tend to sit around for a long time until somebody sort of gets to them? So it can be, somebody, has fallen for one of those scams, and then their name just sits there for 6 months, and then suddenly a company is hit. Or is there any information on like what the time frame tends to be on those?
So you've nailed it. That's basically the way the con op works.
Mm.
Is info stealers sit around in Genesis Market or one of the other markets waiting to go for sale. Somebody's doing scanning and they find an exposed server that is that's looking for credentials, and they figure out by reverse engineering what network it is. So it might be as simple as there's a banner that says this is X manufacturing company, and then you go to Genesis Market and you look to see if there are any credentials for Genesis, for X manufacturing company,
Yeah.
and then you buy those credentials and you use those credentials to log into the network. So that's exactly the way that ConOp works. And that's why these are so dangerous, because that 25 million doesn't mean that 25 million people are going to get hit all at once. But maybe 2 years from now, somebody stumbles across a misconfigured VPN that you can log into without multi-factor authentication, and an employee, maybe even an employee who doesn't work there anymore, but whose credentials are still sitting on that VPN, you're able to use those credentials to log into that. That's why, again, as part of that identity management, it's so important to understand who doesn't work for your company anymore, who
Oh
doesn't
yeah.
shouldn't have access anymore, and making sure they're removed from all the systems they shouldn't have access to, which is shockingly hard to do well. But because generally, I mean, there are some companies that obviously have it really down to a science, and that's great. And I wish more companies would do that. But too often, our credentials aren't, like, we don't have a single source of truth. We have multiple sources of truth, and if you make one mistake in the offboarding process, those credentials sit there forever unchanged.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost makes me wonder too. There was a piece of password protection that has kind of gone out of favor, which is, having passwords expire. And I think that some of the rationale for that was that, if you make people come up with a new password every, month or every 3 months, then they're just coming up with bad passwords that they can just iterate quickly. And the idea was, if you leave it, and just encourage them to come up with really strong passwords and then just use those, that's great. But if these are sitting around for a while, that seems like that's sort of a case for, refreshing passwords and getting users to change them.
Yeah, so the NIST guidelines do not recommend changing passwords,
Right.
and I, your reasoning makes sense to me. It's why I think we probably should have some sort of, if not a if not a requirement to change the passwords, have some sort of mechanism built in that if somebody doesn't log into a certain point of time,
Mm.
their account automatically expires or goes into a dormant mode,
Yeah.
or something like that, right? Because you know if you're using good multi-factor authentication, password changing shouldn't matter, but the reality is that most people don't do it as effectively as they could. And if that's the case, then password rotation does make sense. But again, you have to make sure you're rotating across all the systems they have access to.
Gotcha. Yeah, another question here. What are you seeing in terms of, when ransomware attacks come, you know, like where they're encrypting data versus just stealing the information, and then, doing sort of a blackmail on the stolen information.
Right now, about 30% of all attacks that we see are data theft only. That's up from about 10% like 2 years ago, roughly.
Yeah.
So that is, it's not the norm now, but it's moving that way. Dealing with encryption is a mess. Dealing with executables is a mess, and getting in and out of networks can be challenging. So if you can just steal the data from wherever, that's easier for the bad guys, and so they're going to take the easy path as long as they keep making money at it.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well, in the title of this, we talked about heroes and villains, and sort of lessons. So maybe that'd be a good place to close. Any heroes in 2024, so far in the ransomware fight?
Law enforcement has carried out 20 actions against ransomware actors so far this year, which is more than we've seen in any other point. Seen at any short period of time, up to and including permanently shutting down a number of ransomware groups, a number of arrests, and in particular, a number of arrests of people associated with initial access. So some of the tools used by initial access brokers like TrickBot and IceID and others, those people were actually arrested as part of that particular operation, which is Operation Endgame. Speaking of superhero movies, actually resulted in the arrest of 8 threat actors. And wasn't a permanent disruption because none of this is permanent, unfortunately. But it actually, we could see from when these people were arrested before their systems got reconstituted, we could see a noticeable drop off in the number of ransomware attacks because there was nobody feeding the initial access to them.
That's pretty good news. What about on the villain side? Who are some of the big villains of 2024?
Well, so the big one is right now Ransom Hub. That is, that's sort of taking the place of Lockbit as the go-to for a lot of the affiliates. And so that's the one that we're kind of concentrating on right now and figuring out the best defenses against and so on. And so I think that's kind of your big villain of the year.
Yeah. Okay. And last question for you, Allan, just in terms of big lessons from 2024 that will help people in 2025, and any big takeaways from this year?
Yeah, so I do think, and I know I spent a lot of time talking about it, but I think because it is so important, that data governance component, which again, not part of traditional security. It's funny, you talk to CISOs now, and they not only have to be data governance experts, but they also have to be geopol experts now, right? Because of all the rules and regulations involved in security and all of the which group's fighting which group and why is North Korea attacking me on behalf of Russia and so on. And so there are all of these things that you and I, having done this for a really long time, were never part of our security kind of uh, uh, bailiwick that are suddenly in our bailiwick of, we have to do these things. And so worrying and understanding your data governance for me right now is the big thing, because we are seeing that move to data theft only. And again, just like it doesn't matter where the data comes from, your company's going to get called out if it's the big company. It doesn't matter that you weren't responsible for data governance. If it's presumed to be a breach, even if it's a breach of one of your partners or vendors, CEO is going to come to you, the CISO, and say, what'd you do, man? How come you didn't secure that? And so, you want to have an answer for them as to what you want to have an answer in place for why and what happened.
Yeah. All right. Great advice. Well, Allan, it's always fantastic to check in with you. Love to get your perspective. With your ear to the ground as it is on ransomware. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, no problem. This was great as always. I love talking to you, Scott.
Likewise. All right. Take care. Okay, and before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today to start us off for the weekend is Eliza Verani from Georgia. So congratulations to Eliza. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsors for making this event possible: Commvault, Rubrik, Druva, SentinelOne, and Zerto. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That's going to conclude today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day and a great weekend.